Good morning, my friends. Thanks for joining me for another of our Unfolding the Word times. We're nearly done now with our study in 1 Kings, looking at the issue of discouragement and depression in our lives, examining that through the lens of this episode in the life of the prophet Elijah, following the Mount Carmel episode, an episode explained to us, developed for us in the 19th chapter of 1 Kings. Today I want to pick up our reading in that chapter in verse 18. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. We've been looking at how to climb out of the pits in the last couple of days. Those things that happened in God's purpose is working with Elijah to bring him back into productive service, out from running away, out from disillusionment and discouragement in his life. The first of those things you remember was to see his situation through God's eyes. As he re-examined his situation after having some changed perspective on God, the situation hadn't changed. The details about it were the same, but he had changed. Because now that he saw God differently, he could respond to the same set of facts about the situation in a different way. When we see God properly, it changes everything. And of course, as I've said so many times, we see God properly only when we see him as the scripture presents him. The more we know the word, the better picture of God we're going to have. That's why we sit under the teaching of the word. That's why we study the word on our own. The clearer you see God as he reveals himself in the scriptures, the more successful you will be in responding to circumstances. Related to that was the second of the steps, where Elijah had come to the point of accepting that God was still in control, even when God was not working as he expected God to work. You remember that perspective change? God was not in the wind, God was not in the earthquake, God was not in the fire, but was in the very still, small voice. When our particular understanding of how God should be working isn't being worked out in practice, it doesn't mean God isn't working. It just simply means we have too limited a view of how God works. The issue wasn't whether God had power to work as a wind, as a fire, or as an earthquake. The issue was, what was God's purpose? In this case, God's purpose was the still small whisper. Yesterday, we looked at the challenge in the preceding verses to Elijah to get back into the game. God says, okay, listen, you're starting to have these perspective changes. You're seeing these things. Now get back into the game. Start serving me again. Here are some specific tasks I want you to carry out. There is no moving back out of the pits to the degree that we stay out of the game. We have to step forward independent of our emotions, independent of our feelings. Get out there and be doing the things that need to be done. Acts 20, as we looked at in Paul's description of his life and ministry to the Ephesian elders, said, hey, listen, my life's worth nothing unless I'm fulfilling the purpose of God. You're not going to get out of discouragement, disillusionment, and despair to the degree you're not doing what God's calling you to do. As you're doing that, he will work through it to help get the feelings. You don't wait for feelings. Feelings will follow actions. Now today, in verse 18 that I read to you, we find a fourth of these steps to climbing back out of the pits. And this step is a very revealing one. You remember several times Elijah had responded to God by saying, I'm the only one who's faithful to you. I'm the only one who hasn't bowed the knee, and so forth. We needed to understand in all of our life circumstances, and Elijah needed to understand, he wasn't the only one. There are other brothers and sisters who are facing the same set of circumstances possibly, or other equally difficult circumstances, and are remaining faithful to the Lord. And so God makes it a point with Elijah to remind him he was not alone. His sense that he was the only prophet left, that he was the only one who was faithful, the only one who hadn't bowed the knee to Baal, was simply not right. He wasn't unique. There were others who were facing exactly the same sets of circumstances in Israel who were trusting God and staying the course. He wasn't alone. If you and I could see the truth about people, we would see, as God understands, that there's a number of other people who love him, who are facing equally discouraging circumstances, and yet are continuing to hold to him. We are not alone. We have not faced some overwhelming issue that simply is beyond the ability to rest in the Lord about. There will always be others. Then he builds on this and he says, now listen, Elijah, the truth of the matter is, I have 7,000 in Israel. It's not just like there's one or two others you just didn't know about. There's 7,000 who haven't bowed the knee to Baal. Now, historians tell us that in Israel at that period, the suggested population was somewhere 2.5 to 3 million people. King David, some generations preceding this event in 1 Kings 19, had counted the fighting men that made up the army that Israel could be drawing upon. And at that time, Israel's population was even a little bit bigger, and there were 800,000 fighting men that could be drawn upon. Now, let's assume it's around 3 million. Now, God says, listen, there's 7,000 that haven't bowed the knee. And this is kind of a mixed thing. The fact is, you're not alone, but there's 7,000 out of 3 million. Oh, well, wait a second, that's still not too many. Well, no, it's not too many. It's 1/4%. Let's put it a different way. That means there's one person out of every 400 that you would know in Israel who were trusting God, who were remaining faithful and had not bowed the knee. One out of every 400. I mean, that's not very good. But yet they were there. And God says, listen, Elijah, understand. There's 7,000 out there who love me like you love me, who have determined not to compromise their faith, who are not adopting the views of the world around them, and are staying faithful to me. The real issue isn't, are there 7,000 left in Israel? Are there 700,000 left in Israel? The issue isn't how many. The issue is you're not alone. Let me repeat it to you. In your life circumstance, in the world you find yourself in, the issue isn't how many believers are there that are trusting God and remaining faithful. The issue is there are some, and you need to know that, so that the woe is me, I'm all alone, I'm the only one faithful, that mentality doesn't grip you. The enemy wants it to grip you. So in the feeling of woe is me, you seem to justify your discouragement. Others are facing it too. God knows the specifics of your situation. He knows how difficult it is for you, but he also knows some other things. He promises us in 1 Corinthians 10:13 that no temptation has overtaken you except which is common to man, and God is faithful, and with the temptation will provide a means of escape so you may be able to bear up under it and escape it. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, after the chapter on faith, Hebrews 11, God summarizes that in saying, listen, there's a cloud of witnesses, people of faith, a cloud. The 7,000 that were in Israel at this time are part of that cloud, but there's others too. There's a cloud of witnesses who have gone before. They are proving in before and in our current world. They are proving to us that God is worth serving even in the face of confusion, even in the face of opposition, even in the face of feeling like we're absolute minority and everybody hates us. He is worth serving and continuing to live surrendered to. Elijah wasn't the only faithful one who was suffering. Here's the problem. When we hurt, when we are discouraged, that hurt and that discouragement tends to blind us to the very real loads that are existing on the shoulders of other people. People who are still following the Lord and caring and trusting. It helps us to know others are facing similar situations and remaining faithful, finding grace in the midst of it. So we open our eyes beyond our own problem to theirs, and together encourage one another as long as it is called today, as Hebrews 3 tells us, that we would remain faithful to Him. Part of getting out of the pits is to understand others are facing hard times too, who love the Lord, and they are continuing to be faithful in the face of the hard times. Join me tomorrow as we conclude our study, Lord willing, of this depression question as it relates to 1 Kings 19. God bless.